Today we have a beautiful attacking game from Bobby Fischer where he goes after his opponent's king. And I want you to notice something as the game progresses. Notice how he isn't sidetracked by his opponent's threats. Anytime he can avoid those threats and not worry about them, he doesn't. He focuses all of his attention on his opponent's king. His opponent in this game is Nicholas Rossolimo, a grandmaster, originally born in Russia, but then by way of Greece and France ended up living in New York City, where he lived the rest of his life. This game was played in 1965 in the U.S. Championship. Fischer has white, Rossolimo has black. Let us jump right in. Fischer begins with e4. No surprise. Rossolimo e6, the French defense. d4, d5, and knight to c3 from Fischer, the main and critical move. Black has a number of responses here, but knight to f6 is what was played by Rossolimo, standard classical French. And here, instead of advancing the pawn to e5, Fischer plays bishop to g5, pinning the knight at f6. Again, black has a number of options here. He can take on e4, he can play the bishop to e7, but Rossolimo plays the most aggressive move available to black in this position, bishop to b4, known as the McCutcheon variation of the French defense. It looks similar to the Winnower variation, where you play bishop to b4 instead of knight to f6. And in this position, the board tends to get really cut in half, with black having very intense play on the queen side and white on the king side. This game is no exception to that. Fischer gains space with e5, and at first it may look like he's winning this knight because it is pinned, but he doesn't, because Rossolimo can play this move h6. Kicking the bishop. And if Fischer plays bishop to h4, then just g5, bishop g3, and then knight to e4, putting pressure on this pinned knight, and black is fine. So because of that, Fischer plays the main move here, which is bishop to d2, removing the pin from the knight at c3 and asking black what he wants to do with the knight. First of all, black plays bishop takes c3. And the next move might surprise some people if you're not familiar with the variation. He takes with the pawn. The reason is, after bishop takes c3, knight to e4, and black is threatening that bishop, and the dark squared bishop is one of white's better pieces in this opening. He doesn't want to part with it, although eventually he does anyway. But he takes with the pawn, and for the moment has the bishop pair and an unopposed dark squared bishop. Now the knight can come into e4. Now, just like in the Winnower, the weakest square in black's position is this g7 square. Weak because the bishop at f8 has already left. So Fischer immediately attacks it with queen to g4, aiming right at the g7 square. Black has to deal with that. They can play king to f8. That's a move, but the more common move played in this game is just g6. The one downside, this does leave some dark squared weaknesses that Fischer can work on. Now here, Fischer plays bishop to d3, preparing this bishop to attack. Sometimes there'll be some sacrificial attacks on g6 from white, or use the pawn at the h-pawn to h4, h5 coordination with this bishop to attack. But it does allow this move from Rossolimo. That's knight takes d2, getting rid of the dark squared bishop. And now Fischer's king cannot castle and is stuck in the middle of the board. Of course, black's king is in the middle of the board. He's definitely not going to castle kingside. He would just get destroyed. So both kings are vulnerable in this line. So what black wants to do is he plays c5. He wants to open up the queen side and try to get at Fischer's king with moves like knight to c6, queen to a5, putting as much pressure as possible on Fischer's position. Fischer responds with the simple knight to f3, just adding some defense to the pawn, and the knight can be posted more aggressively. Knight to c6, adding the pressure, again, the possibility of exchanging on d4, exposing the king. Here, Fischer plays queen to f4. Now, this clears the way for the g and h pawns to rush up the board to attack. Also, if this queen moves, he might be able to enter into this f6 square with the queen. That can cause some trouble for black as well. The queen goes to c7, and Fischer plays h4, standard idea, trying to soften things up on the king side. But that allows Rossolimo's next move, and that is this move, f5, because there's a pin on this e-pawn. If Fischer were to take en passant, he would just lose his queen. So that means this pawn gets to stay here for now. And Rossolimo was hoping to lock things up like this on the king side. Whether it's a good move or not, I don't know. You can debate it. But the problem for black is that Fischer has another way to get at this structure, and that's the move g4. He immediately begins to put pressure on that kingside structure. Rossolimo takes on d4, Fischer takes back. And now the best idea probably is to play bishop to d7, just castle long and get on with the game. But Rossolimo plays the move knight to e7, trying to shore up g6 and also f5. The knight might be able to jump into f5 after taking on g4 later. Fischer goes ahead and takes immediately. And here, taking with the g-pawn was probably the better option, just sort of leaving this structure strong and then just, again, bishop d7 and long castling. But Rossolimo takes with the e-pawn, strangely enough. The idea is, even though he's giving Fischer a protected passed pawn, he wants to play bishop to e6, be solid there, and then attack from that position. But Fischer's next move makes that very difficult. He plays the move bishop to b5 check. And of course, if the bishop interferes, then he could take them off, and now there would be no way to easily blockade the passed pawn. So because of that, Rossolimo plays king to f8. He really wants that bishop on e6, so that bishop can't get there. He's got some serious problems. So he's willing to give up castling rights just so he can get that bishop there. The bishop comes back to d3. Now the bishop goes to e6. Now, we can ask ourselves one of the classic strategic questions, which is, what is my worst placed piece and where should I put it? In Fischer's position, his rooks are not yet developed, but they're not badly placed. They can have access to good squares. It's actually this knight at f3 that is not that well placed. And the best square for this knight, believe it or not, is f4, the square the queen is currently on. So Fischer begins the journey. He plays knight to g1 with the idea of knight to h3, the queen moving out of the way, and then the knight going to f4, where it can again put pressure on this blockading bishop. The king goes to f7, knight to h3, continuing its journey, also keeping g5 under some control. Rook a to c8, with the potential for checks on c3. Rook h to g1. King to e2, avoiding the check, might have been a little bit better. But rook h to g1 was played. And here, black should definitely have played queen to c3 check. Now, in my 60 memorable games, Fischer thought king to e3 was just winning for white. But as it turns out, white is actually only a little bit better. Modern computers show us that the move g5 is pretty strong for black here, because after pawn takes, what black does is play knight to g6, hitting the queen, and say the queen goes to f3, then a move like rook to c4, and we see the black collapsing on d4. The bishop can't take the rook because it's pinned. And black gets some activity here. White's probably a little bit better still, but it's not that much fun for white. King to e2 was probably better, but then after rook to c4, piling up on the pressure on d4, and if the rook, is taken, pawn takes, and black has a good position here. He may not be better, but he's fine. The queen is threatening c2 as well as the knight on h3. The knight can come into d5. He's down in exchange, but has a lot of counterplay. But instead, Rossolimo plays b6, and I can't for sure say why. It didn't quite work. He needed to be a little sharper in a position like this. So Fischer jumps at the opportunity. He plays h5, trying to weaken this structure. If black responds with g5, then Fischer would just sack the knight. Knight g5, and then after queen g5, that's it. The queen is coming into f6, and black is not going to be long for this world. The game is pretty much over at that point. So queen to c3 check is played here. Now he plays it. The king goes to e2, knight to c6, building up pressure on the d4 pawn, but that allows pawn takes pawn check. King goes to g7, trying to use Fischer's own pawn to protect that king. Rook a to d1. It's kind of an x-ray defense on d4, but the pawn is going to fall. It's not a defense, totally. Knight takes d4 with check. The king goes to f1. But Rossolimo's problem mainly is that this knight and queen, even though they're very well placed, they're just not quite enough. He needs a way to get the rooks involved, this bishop involved. Two pieces just isn't enough for an effective attack. But Fischer has more pieces involved in his attack. Rook h to e8. And here what Fischer wants to do, he wants to play queen to h4 with the idea of going into f6 with check, which he could play here. When I first saw his next move, he plays rook to g3. I thought he was trying to control f3 because after queen to h4, black can play knight to f3. But actually, white is still completely winning after queen to f6 check. Anyway, but rook to g3 does serve a useful purpose. It does keep the knight out, and it creates some x-ray attack potential against black's queen on c3. So knight to c6, now queen to h4, aiming at this f6 square. So black has to take the pawn. He can't allow the queen to land on f6. He takes with the knight, and now knight to f4. The knight's journey to that f4 square is over, and it's threatening knight h5 check. Maybe he could take the bishop. The knight is really, really well placed here. Now knight to g4 from black, a good move, not only blocking the rook's access to the pawn, but it covers the f6 square in two ways. So it's a good move. Here, knight to h5 is not bad, but Fischer plays a much stronger move and shows that the knight at g4 isn't good enough. He plays knight takes e6 check. After rook takes, he plays this amazing, well, it's not amazing, it's pretty obvious at this point, but it's a very, very strong move. Bishop takes f5. So now there are three pieces under attack. The rook at g3 hits the queen, and the bishop attacks the knight and the rook. Rossolimo plays queen to c4 check to get the queen out of threat, but then Fischer plays king to g1. And in this position, black resigned. He just can't save the material with the double attack on the rook and the knight. Black's best is to just give up the knight by playing knight takes f2, but the problem with that is Fischer would take the queens off, and after king to f2, this is a completely winning position for white. Not only does he have the extra piece, but this g6 pawn is devastating. So an interesting game, Fischer and Rossolimo. The board got cut in half, and Rossolimo just didn't have enough firepower to compete with Fischer's position. I hope you've enjoyed this game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.